Hey guys, this is Tyler here. It is the beginning of May, so we are almost to summer. It's a very beautiful day here. And I'm going to discuss with everyone here about some big misconceptions with Generation Z dating and relationships. Now, if any of you guys, and I know many of you have followed me for some time, I've spoken about Generation Z dating regarding dating apps and all sorts of situations. And I see a very common trend, especially for my, whether it's family or friends that are in this dating bracket. And it's something that I've seen consistently come up. And this is worldwide. This isn't just like in the US or England, Germany. This is like everywhere. One of the things, first major misconceptions that I see is many men now there's kind of this reputation, and I think this was built from a couple generations ago when men on a whole just had a much better environment for relationship creation and marriage and all that entailed, is that they're not willing to commit to the person. And I hear this so often. Famous podcaster Stefan Molyneux from Canada, he has very, very phenomenal philosophy-based videos, but one of the things I don't agree with him upon is this common thing that he brings up about these younger men not willing to commit. And I see that it's actually quite the opposite now. I think it's actually vice versa. It's more so a lot of younger females are not willing to commit, like especially in this Generation Z bracket. It's just the number of them that are willing to commit and to continue with a guy who's also very committed and has really gone down. And also that also applies to the institution of marriage. I know many of you guys, of course, have no interest in marriage, but one thing I will say here is that in some countries, even the one I live here in Estonia, marriage laws are quite different, and also divorce laws. I think it's not nearly as harsh when divorce happens and all that entails. I think it's much less severe. So just keep that in mind when I bring that up, because some people are like, oh, marriage, that's like almost a bad word for our MGTOW community. But really, it's quite different in many of the Eastern European countries. And even over in Russia nowadays, like you compare how it was 10 or 20 years ago to now, in many young ladies do not want to get married there, at least at a young age. I mean, it's very different wanting to say marry when you're like 30, 35 plus. That's quite different than a gal who's like 20 years old. Because as we know, I think it's sometimes best to look at relationships in the sense with women often there's the time thing is the most precious element. Honestly, when you look at it, what you're really buying is time. That's where the value is with a younger woman. It's much more so that than anything else. When you think of the value and the when relationship happens, it's really the time. That's ultimately what a guy's paying for, is the time. Especially when they're getting the gals when they're real young, and the most optimal period for marriage and all that is like that. And that's obviously too when they get the most concentrated amount of attention. As they get older, it gradually dies down, the amount of attention. And for some women, they reach a certain age and it virtually goes to nil. Yeah, for others, they may continue receiving a lot of or some attention, but it's probably not from very high quality guys. And in some cases, it's very low tier guys that are going for these gals then. So just keep that in mind. But like, I have a brother and I also have a few friends over in Russia. There's a kind of a mutual friend of mine, and we've discussed this. He had the same experience that my brothers had, and a few other friends of mine. A lot of these younger women now, they do not want to get married over in Russia. I mean, we hear this whole commitment issue. Oh, men aren't willing to commit. Maybe in other cultures, maybe this is the case in Hispanic or in, I don't know, some of the Asian cultures, but certainly like within European cultures, men and women from European groups of people, whether it's Russian or English, German, Spanish, whatever, I actually, I see a lot of men especially younger men that are very willing to commit, and these women are not. That's consistently what I'm seeing, even with guys that are classified as high S&B, high sexual market value men in the relationship scene. These women are just not willing to commit, and so for those guys, if it's problem, you can only imagine for the lower S&B guys. It's even much worse of a problem, because many of those will be lucky if they can even get a relationship of any kind from the get-go. And I also think that this may also be due to another issue which kind of ties in here, and that's the ineffective communication dialogue that now often occurs between men and women. I've noticed this. I have a sister, and she's Gen X. She's on the further end of Gen X, and she's been married now for many years. Her and her husband have very fluid, very good dialogue. And especially for her being a woman, of almost any women that I've ever known, I think she's probably one of the best when it comes to being very upright and just to the point with problems or needs or whatever. What I see now, especially in certain cultures, for people who say are Western European, who think that it's really poor, like the communication with their women and their environments, it can be a lot worse. You go over to like Russia or Ukraine. These are cultures that historically have not been known for having very high verbal acumen, we might say. They're not like renowned for this in the same way that like French or English or even like Spaniards would be. And this can be a huge problem. There's just a very ineffective amount of dialogue. So you can be totally blindsided. And so when you get into whether it's conflict resolution, figuring out a system for resolving issues or whatever it is, it's not brought into the picture here. And I would say that even if you did bring this up with the gal you were with, they probably wouldn't really be that interested in coming to a consensus on how you were going to resolve differences or how communication was going to take place. How, in terms of if we make commitments, what's the method for following through here, and if what are the situations where if something can't happen, you can't show up, what are the reasons why like someone can cancel, and what would happen if the person did cancel and there wasn't really a good reason to. This kind of thing is, really been thrown out the door, and this is a problem I see all across the world now. And I suspect that it's not just with younger gals, it's also many younger guys. There's probably the same kind of issue here, because I've made observations with Gen Z guys that I've known, Estonia, Russia, Lithuania, the US. I've seen their dialogue skills and just having a level of integrity when commitment and stuff has really gone down, as would make sense. It's not just the women. So for guys that are from older even millennial, and definitely Generation X, it's something very foreign, because the guy, like, to see this now very widespread for both the men and the women. So I would suspect this is something that the females also are accustomed to for men of their age group, this demographic, and it's terrible. It sets terrible precedents. And this is not just in the case of relationships. This also applies to workplace, to all sorts of relationships. Not being effective in this area and sticking to commitments and having a system in place for whatever reason. This is based obviously too in trust and integrity. This has massive repercussions. When I had a startup, many people here will know that my brother and I had a startup going. It was a couple years ago, technology brand, and there was at one point I had an intern working for me, and this was an issue I noticed with this fellow, and I thought maybe this was just an exception. Maybe this was just one guy like this. And then I encountered other guys, and also with less formal situations, maybe just going out to kick a ball around or hit the weights or something, and these guys would not respond. They wouldn't follow through on such small commitments, or at least explain what, okay, I'm not going to be here, I can't show up, and some would just totally ghost. It was something I started seeing more with these guys, and I also suspect that some of this is tied to the fact that a lot of these younger guys now are being brought up under single mother households. I've mentioned this issue before. It's so common now, more and more guys. This is so foreign, especially for Gen X guys and even for millennial guys to a degree. Millennial guys were much more used to, I think, paternal guidance, and whether it was in the home or in school, wherever, and definitely Generation X guys. But whereas for the across the board, whether it's people in the inner city, in nice areas, all over the world, more and more guys are being brought up in these with a lot of feminine influence, and this obviously has massive repercussions. I mean, historically, it would say be up until the age of 5 or 6, maybe 8 years old, whereas now it's up through the teens, and that kind of influence is going really. It's actually biologically going to morph into how a guy develops their brain structure and stuff, and certainly how they approach communication and conflict resolution. Obviously, when we look at it from a biological perspective too, the neurosis that many women have, whether young or old, was very much intended for when they were raising young children, babies, until through early childhood to ensure survival. Now, once the child though reaches a certain age, that neurosis is not necessary. And some of the other traits that come with that are not necessary especially for boys. For males, it's actually often more detrimental. And there has to be, at that point, then it's best if a man starts taking over and infusing the traits that a guy needs for getting into adulthood. But we're seeing that kind of this, it's really backwards nowadays with how society has gone. And these are issues to be aware of. If you're going into this Generation Z dating, you cannot feel bad as a guy if you're experiencing this. I think often happens in culture and society is that many guys, say, who are baby boomers, may have dated or married a Gen X woman, and then a Gen X guy may have been with a millennial, and then the millennial are looking down to Generation Z. And don't ask me what Generation Z is going to be looking down towards. I don't even want to know the kind of traits that are going to be exhibited at that point. We obviously already see a situation with the older millennials, and I can testify to this from familial experience and observation. The usage of some kind of narcotic, mind-inducing narcotic for depression and all these other anxiety and mental illnesses or mental issues, is really going up each year. And with that older millennial group, you're seeing the impact of just many bad decisions over many years. It will be really interesting in 10 or 15 years with the women that reach that age group, what that will be like then. I would suspect it's going to be that much worse. This cycle, generally, it would only make sense. And obviously the pharma sector is they're going to try to capitalize and use this, ensure as much profit as they can from this equation to just continue enriching themselves. I also think too that Gen Z, we obviously see the impact of dating apps and Instagram and OnlyFans, these kind of applications. There's a lot of overstimuli. There's just too many people colliding, being brought into younger women's lives nowadays, and that also makes it that much more difficult for them to make these commitments and to stay with the person they're with and to go forth with marriage. And also note that what I see with marriage in US or Canada, for example, is it's really, if a woman's not massively benefiting especially a beautiful woman, they probably are not going to have any interest in marriage. We've only seen a few exceptions. We saw like Britney Spears like 10 or 12 years ago. She was with that DJ and she ended up having to pay him out a large sum of money, and then child support for like 20,000, and it was like 35,000 or 40,000 a month. Those are very rare cases, so it's usually vice versa. And I would suspect, like, even in places like in Russia and Ukraine, my brother's in Russia, as I mentioned, that's one of the reasons why these women, they're not benefiting, even like in a divorce case, especially there's no kids involved, they're not benefiting that much like in the case of a marriage or divorce. So that's why they probably aren't too eager to go forth with that. In other countries, it's the same way. So that's probably a major factor why you see the same trend here. They're not going down this path and just kind of sticking with this hookup situation and this sense of abundance here. And also, obviously, there's just more and more like desperate guys out there. I noticed this, and this is a kind of a misconception too, that in some countries especially, and I noted this when I was doing some research and viewing other like YouTubers about like OnlyFans and these kind of platforms, these guys that pay all this money for pictures or for personal experiences with these kind of online escorts. And I see that kind of this trend here that some of the most popular gals that I've noticed, they have like kids, they have some other unusual aspect. Some can be kind of like fat. Some of these women legitimately are fat. There's a lot of guys that have a fetish for this. Some are like legitimately pregnant. There's guys that have a fetish for this thing and all these kind of weird things. And I'm almost to the point where I think that those gals, because those guys are the biggest simps, they are the most like weird and just desperate, they will actually pay more than like the normal attractive 8, 9, or 10 gal that's like normal. They would pay like a lot more because it's the kind of guys that are often into those type of gals. So I see sometimes in some countries like in Eastern Europe, the gal who's like the 6 or 7, especially online, can actually get more interest than the gal who's like a 9 or a 10, because a lot of the guys maybe assume she already has a lot of options, and then a lot of the guys that aren't really getting a lot of interest, those guys intentionally go a little lower because they think, okay, this girl's gonna be easier and it will be more likely to result in something. And then some of those gals end up actually having the worst attitudes. And I noticed this when I was on Tinder in Russia. Like these gals that were like not like the greatest, most attractive, actually were worse than gals that were like solid 8s. It was unbelievable. And I had a very attractive ex-girlfriend, and and this is not the only thing to look at. I mean, physically though, she far better than like some of the gals that had very poor attitudes with me. And these gals were, I guess they were under this notion because they got all this online interest that they could be this way. So many of the guys like a long time ago were saying, oh, go for like the 6 or 7s rather than go for like 8s, 9s, or 10s. That was, I think, more of a Gen X mentality. They'll be easier, they'll be nicer, but now often those gals aren't any better. In some cases they're worse. So I just tell younger guys now, go for whatever you want. I mean, because you're really not going to see much difference, especially with the whole online influence and all the other things that have came into the picture recently. So this is kind of my thoughts here on this Sunday, and I look forward to your feedback here. Thank you.